Before colonialism carved its lines across Africa, there were kingdoms, battles, betrayals, and cities that refused to fall. This is the true story of the Egba people and their legendary stand against the powerful Kingdom of Dahomey. From the rise of Abeokuta in the 1840s to the fierce invasions by King Ghezo and later King Ghezo, this documentary uncovers how a refugee city fought back against one of West Africa's most feared empires, and won. This is not fiction. This is a true African history, bold, bloody, and buried no more. They came with fire in their eyes and skulls on their belts. Warriors who drank blood and swore oaths with iron. An empire built on chains marched east, hungry for land, power, and people. But what they met was not a kingdom. They met a rock, a people carved from exile, forged in pain, and bound by something no army could conquer: unity. This is not just a story of war. It is the story of two worlds colliding, one ruled by sacrifice, fear, and the trade of human flesh, the other by memory, defiance, and the will to survive. When Dahomey marched on Abeokuta, they did not expect resistance. They expected silence. What they got was thunder, because in this war, the hunted became the hunters, and the empire of skulls cracked on the rock. In the early 19th century, West Africa was in crisis. The once powerful Oyo Empire, long considered the dominant Yoruba force, had begun to collapse. A combination of internal civil wars, external wars, Fulani jihadi expansion, and economic ruin shattered its structure. By the 1830s, Oyo's authority had crumbled completely. Amidst the chaos, the Egba people, a Yoruba subgroup, were displaced. Their ancestral towns like Ijaye, Ibara, and Itoko were overrun by violence. Refugees fled southward in waves, searching for safety. Their search led them to a unique location, a massive granite outcrop surrounded by hills and forests, a naturally defensible position. They named it Abeokuta, meaning under the rock. Between 1830 and 1835, Egba refugees from various clans, Ake, Oke-Ona, Gbagura, and Owu, began to settle there. Together they formed an informal alliance, each clan governed by its own chiefs, but all united in defense and survival. This marked the beginning of the Egba Confederacy. By the 1840s, Abeokuta had grown into a fortified city, not a kingdom, but a stronghold. The Egba developed local governance, built walls, formed militias, and trained hunters and warriors for any future threat. That threat would come soon. To the west, the Kingdom of Dahomey was rising under King Ghezo, who had come to power in 1818. Once a tributary to Oyo, Dahomey had used Oyo's collapse to assert independence, but the kingdom faced its own challenges. Its northern land was infertile, and its wealth depended heavily on the Atlantic slave trade, a trade that was rapidly declining. The British Empire, now pushing anti-slavery treaties along the coast, had begun to squeeze Dahomey's economy. By the 1840s, King Ghezo found himself under intense pressure. With fewer slaves available from his own territory, and with resistance growing across Yoruba land, Dahomey looked eastward for new sources of captives and power. The Egba Confederacy, and Abeokuta in particular, stood directly in his path. The fertile lands of Egbado, Ajase-Ipo, and other southern territories had once served as major slave routes. Now they were controlled or protected by the Egba. Ghezo's agents reported that these territories no longer cooperated, and captives were no longer flowing. The Egba were not just resisting, they were blocking the slave trade. This made them an enemy. In 1843, under Ghezo's direct orders, Dahomey began organizing large-scale military expeditions eastward. These were not simple raids, they were full invasions, intended to break the Egba and reopen the slave routes by force. By 1844, the first military clashes had begun. The war that would follow would not only reshape the future of the Egba and Dahomey, it would become one of the bloodiest and most decisive regional conflicts in 19th century West Africa. And it was just beginning. By 1844, the tension between the Egba Confederacy and the Dahomey Kingdom had escalated beyond the point of diplomacy. For King Ghezo of Dahomey, the situation was clear. Unless the slave routes through Egba territory were reopened, his kingdom's economy would collapse. For the Egba, allowing Dahomey forces to pass through their lands meant opening their people to raids, death, and captivity. The path to peace was closed. War had begun. The first major clash took place at Oke-Adan, a strategic frontier settlement near the Egba border. Dahomey forces, heavily armed and organized in traditional regiments, pushed into Egba territory with the intent to intimidate and capture villages for slaves. But the Egba were ready. Led by the respected war chief Oshodi, Egba warriors set up defensive ambushes along known forest paths. Dahomey's soldiers, confident and reliant on their traditional warfare formations, marched into narrow trails, unaware they were walking into a trap. At Oke-Adan, the Egba struck with ferocity. Using superior knowledge of terrain, guerrilla tactics, and basic firearms supplied through coastal trade, they repelled the Dahomey invasion. It was a major psychological blow. The Dahomey army, especially its elite units, had never expected resistance from a confederation of displaced refugees. The defeat forced Ghezo to retreat, reassess, and prepare a more organized campaign. But the setback only fueled his resolve. Over the next few years, Dahomey intensified its efforts. Smaller raids were conducted across Egbado territory, targeting isolated settlements and attempting to weaken Egba control over border towns. Captives were taken, villages were burnt. The war was slowly escalating. By 1849, King Ghezo decided to take matters into his own hands. He personally led a major offensive deep into Egba territory, aiming to destroy resistance and take control of the slave corridors once and for all. The target was a location near the frontier, Imoshe. This time, the Dahomey army was better prepared. They came with hundreds of experienced warriors, including elements of their feared Amazon regiments, the all-female elite unit that often served as shock troops. But the Egba had also evolved. Still under the leadership of Oshodi, the Egba forces were now battle-tested. They had fortified key positions, trained local militias, and had begun to receive more organized support through their growing ties with British missionaries and coastal allies. At Imoshe, the two sides clashed in open combat. The Dahomey army brought guns, drums, and battle chants, but the Egba used strategic positioning, close-quarter combat, and superior discipline. After hours of fighting, the Egba managed to break the Dahomey advance, forcing another retreat. In the process, they captured valuable firearms and ammunition, boosting their defense capacity. By the end of 1849, it was clear that the Egba were not a minor nuisance. They were a serious threat to Dahomey's influence in the region. The twin defeats at Oke-Adan and Imoshe emboldened the Egba people. They reinforced Abeokuta's defenses, trained new fighters, and tightened their alliance with foreign partners. For King Ghezo, the setbacks were humiliating. His vision of Dahomey dominating the Yoruba corridor was crumbling. But he was not done yet. A more devastating strategy was forming, one that would bring fire and fury directly to the gates of Abeokuta. By 1850, the war between Egba and Dahomey was no longer just about land or trade. It had become a war of pride, vengeance, and betrayal. King Ghezo, now humiliated by multiple defeats at Oke-Adan and Imoshe, was desperate. His advisors urged caution, his warriors wanted revenge, his slave routes were blocked, the Egba had made him bleed, and the world was watching. But what Ghezo needed most was an opening, a weakness in Abeokuta's alliances. He found it in Owu. The Owu Kingdom, one of the original clans within the Egba Confederacy, had long been unsettled within the alliance. Political tensions, leadership disputes, and old tribal grievances lingered beneath the surface. Sensing an opportunity, Dahomey envoys made contact with elements of Owu's leadership. Promises were made, gold exchanged hands, and the deadliest of all bargains was struck. Owu would support Dahomey's next invasion in exchange for power. To the rest of the Egba, the betrayal came as a shock. The Confederacy, built on mutual defense and shared trauma, had been pierced from within. The betrayal sparked immediate retaliation. Led by Oshodi and Shodeke, son of Sodeke, the Egba command responded with precision and brutality. They marched directly on Owu, determined to crush the betrayal before Dahomey could capitalize on it. The battle was swift and bloody. Egba forces stormed the town. Resistance was minimal. Many of Owu's defenders were unprepared, and some factions had believed Dahomey would arrive in time to support them. They never came. The Olowu of Owu was captured, publicly humiliated, and executed as a warning to others who might consider allying with Dahomey. What followed was even more symbolic. Owu's leadership was dismantled, and its autonomy within the Egba Confederacy was reduced. The betrayal had failed, and the Egba had proven they would destroy even their own rather than be divided. The execution of Owu's ruler enraged King Ghezo. His plan to destabilize Abeokuta had backfired. Worse still, his allies had been destroyed before his army could intervene. But Ghezo wasn't finished. In the royal palace of Dahomey, a grim ritual was performed. Assembled in the palace courtyard, surrounded by generals, priests of Vodun, and the fearsome Amazon warriors, Ghezo made a public vow, a blood oath. Abeokuta would fall. Thousands of warriors were summoned. The Amazon regiments were armed and blessed. New sacrifices were made, prisoners of war, captives from raids, their blood spilled to invoke ancestral spirits. The kingdom began preparing for a final, massive assault. It would not be a raid or border clash. It would be a full-scale invasion. Inside Abeokuta, word of Ghezo's oath reached the people through scouts and messengers. But the Egba were not shaken. They tightened defenses, fortified city gates, stockpiled food and weapons. War chiefs like Balogun Sukenu, Ogunbona, and Apati drilled militias in shifts. Women and children were trained in emergency drills. Sacred groves were cleansed. British missionaries, though neutral, assisted in tending the wounded and secretly provided arms through merchants from the coast. And then it began. In 1851, thousands of Dahomey warriors, led by Ghezo himself and fronted by the elite Amazon Corps, marched east with one mission: destroy Abeokuta. In July 1851, the Kingdom of Dahomey launched its largest military expedition in decades. At the head of this force was King Ghezo himself, determined to fulfill his blood oath and crush the Egba stronghold of Abeokuta once and for all. Marching beside him were thousands of warriors, including the feared Ahosi, better known as the Dahomey Amazons, the all-female elite regiments that had become the terror of the region. Their numbers were staggering. Historians estimate that over 6,000 troops, including at least 2,000 Amazons, took part in the campaign. Their mission was clear: burn Abeokuta to the ground, reopen the slave routes, reclaim dominance. The Dahomey army advanced quickly through the southwestern plains. Along the way, they attacked the town of Ishaga on the outskirts of Abeokuta and forced its chief to guide them to what was believed to be a vulnerable section of the city wall. Meanwhile, inside Abeokuta, news of the invasion had already spread. The city went on full alert. The Egba Confederacy, led by Sodeke's successor, mobilized every available warrior. Militias were positioned along the walls, trenches were dug, and British-supplied cannons were mounted at key defense points. Women and children were relocated to inner courtyards while elders and priests performed rituals for protection. On the morning of July 3rd, the Dahomey army launched its attack. Wave after wave of warriors stormed the gates. The Amazons led the charge, covered in war paint, armed with muskets, blades, and fierce discipline. Their war cries echoed through the hills as they threw themselves at the city's outer defenses. The Egba defenders, though outnumbered, were highly organized. They used ambush tactics, hidden trenches, and muskets from British allies. Women poured hot water and oil from rooftops, while warriors used the rocky terrain to choke off Dahomey's advances. For 2 straight days, the fighting was brutal and continuous. The Amazons fought like demons, piling bodies into Abeokuta's moats to climb over them. They were relentless, fearless, and disciplined. But the Egba held their ground. On the 3rd day, a turning point came. An Amazon warrior was captured, and only then did the Egba realize the terrifying truth. Many of their fiercest enemies were women. That revelation shocked the defenders, but instead of fear, it ignited rage. Led by warriors like Balogun Sukenu, Ogunbona, and Sariki Apati, the Egba launched a full-scale counterattack. From behind the walls, they surged forward, catching the Dahomey forces in close-quarter combat. At this moment, British cannons loaded with grape shot were fired into the heart of the Dahomey ranks. The result was devastating. The battlefield was turned into chaos. Dozens of Amazons fell instantly. Muskets and traditional weapons clashed violently. The air was thick with smoke, screams, and gunpowder. With hundreds of their elite troops dead and morale crumbling, Dahomey's lines broke. By sunset, the once feared invaders were in full retreat. Out of the 2,000 Amazon warriors who entered Abeokuta, less than 1/200 survived. The rest were either killed or captured. King Ghezo barely escaped with his life, returning to Dahomey in humiliation. It was the first time Dahomey's Amazon Corps had been decisively defeated in open war. The Battle of Abeokuta was more than a military victory. It marked a turning point in West African history. The Egba Confederacy rose to prominence, recognized as a major force among Yoruba and non-Yoruba groups alike. The slave trade suffered a crippling blow, especially as the British used the opportunity to tighten their anti-slavery enforcement along the coast. King Ghezo, though still in power, never recovered his prestige. "13 years after the humiliating defeat at Abeokuta in 1851, the Kingdom of Dahomey returned. This time, King Ghezo was gone. He had died in 1858, disgraced, bitter, and remembered as the first Dahomey ruler to be driven back by a city built under a rock. His son, King Ghezo, had taken the throne. Ghezo inherited not just the crown, but his father's fury and his unfinished war. Where Ghezo had failed to crush Abeokuta, Ghezo swore he would succeed. By 1864, Dahomey had rearmed. The kingdom had stockpiled modern firearms, updated tactics, and trained new regiments, including a refitted corps of Amazon warriors. This would be the second invasion of Abeokuta, and for Dahomey, the last. Ghezo was no fool. He studied his father's mistakes, the frontal charges, the underestimated terrain, the lack of coordinated movement. This time he ordered a multi-directional assault. Rather than rely on a single point of entry, the Dahomey army would encircle Abeokuta, pressing from multiple fronts, using local informants, and exploiting vulnerable border villages to test for weaknesses. Estimates suggest Ghezo mobilized between 8,000 and 10,000 soldiers, including a revitalized force of Amazon fighters, some of them daughters of those killed in the 1851 massacre. The plan was set. The weapons were loaded, and the march began. But Abeokuta was no longer the city it had been in 1851. It had grown larger, stronger, smarter. The Egba Confederacy had learned from every previous attack. Fortifications had been rebuilt with stone and reinforced clay. Trained militias rotated guard shifts year-round. Traps, trenches, and secret flanking paths had been mapped around the city's outer zone. And this time, the Egba had even more weapons, thanks to a growing relationship with British traders and missionaries who continued to view Abeokuta as a stronghold against slavery and regional instability. A new generation of war leaders had risen, seasoned warriors mentored by legends like Oshodi, Ogunbona, and Sokenu. And their minds were not just set on defense, they were prepared to end the war. When Ghezo's army approached Abeokuta, they found the outer villages eerily quiet. Dahomey troops tried to replicate the 1851 tactic, pressuring frontier settlements like Ilogbo, Ibara, and Isaga to break the outer shell. But the Egba had cleared civilians and turned outer areas into kill zones. On the morning of the invasion, Egba scouts lured Dahomey regiments into a forested ridge just west of the city. It was an ambush. Hidden marksmen opened fire. Flaming arrows rained down. Booby-trapped trenches snapped ankles and halted cavalry charges. Ghezo's multi-pronged strategy collapsed almost instantly. The Dahomey forces were divided, unable to regroup or communicate across the rocky terrain. When they finally reached the city gates, the walls didn't fall, they pushed back. Egba defenders, reinforced by fresh fighters from Ijebu and Oyo, poured hot sand, bullets and cannon fire onto the attackers. They used decoy gates, rolling boulders and even burning animal oil to repel climbers. The Amazon warriors, despite their courage, were again decimated. Their charge was met with close-quarter musket fire and improvised explosives, grenades made from gunpowder and sealed gourds. By the second day, morale among Ghezo's troops broke. By the third, the retreat began. King Ghezo survived, but his dreams of conquering Abeokuta died on those rocks. The Second Battle of Abeokuta in 1864 marked the final blow to Dahomey's military ambition. Never again would the kingdom launch a major war into Yoruba territory. The repeated defeats shattered Dahomey's myth of invincibility. Internally, King Ghezo faced discontent. Economically, the collapse of the slave trade, further accelerated by British pressure, left the kingdom exposed. By the 1890s, France had taken notice. In 1894, the once feared Kingdom of Dahomey was defeated by the French army, absorbed into what would later become the Benin Republic. The Amazon core was dissolved. The palaces of Dahomey were burned. The kingdom that once threatened Abeokuta no longer existed. Meanwhile, Abeokuta thrived. It had repelled two of the deadliest invasions in 19th century West African history. It became a center of commerce, Yoruba identity, and anti-slavery advocacy. Its success attracted scholars, missionaries, and African elites returning from Sierra Leone and Brazil. It remained largely independent until being formally absorbed into the British protectorate in the early 20th century, but never as a defeated people. The Egba, forged in exile, had built something the world could not ignore: a city that stood, a people that endured, a legacy that inspired. In an age of empires and chains, the people of Abeokuta chose defiance over surrender. Twice they were tested, twice they held the line. The Dahomey war machine came with skulls, fire and fury, and twice it broke against the rock. Today, Abeokuta still stands, not just as a city but as a memory, a warning, a monument to what happens when the hunted learn to fight and the forgotten become legends. If this story moved you, don't just scroll. Hit that like button to honor the warriors who stood their ground. Drop a comment. Had you ever heard of this war before today? Subscribe to Tales of the Ancestors for more untold African history that the world forgot. Because our stories deserve to be told and remembered.